I want to begin by thanking Jennifer Finkelstein. She courageously, as you all know, began this organization for women who were under the age of 40, who were diagnosed with breast cancer. And for many of us in this room, it was a club we didn't want to join, but we have each other. And that is so much a part of what you were trying to create, this community. And this conversation that isn't out there because people think, and so many in the media believe, that this is an older woman's disease. This affects women of all ages. And when it affects you at a certain or at a younger age, you have a whole other host of problems. So we battle the worst of it, and we're still here. We're still not just surviving, but thriving. And it's because of one another that we have each other. And I don't want to delay or even just, you know how much I adore you, Dr. Elizabeth Comen, how much she does for the breast cancer community, not just with her incredible work as a physician, but just her advocacy for research, for finding a cure, for beating this insidious disease. And I know you won't stop. You'll keep doing what you're doing. And while you're busy being an unbelievable breast oncologist and a mother to 3, a beautiful daughter and wife, and all of those roles that you fill, you also found time to write a book talking about other issues that women face in the healthcare community. And it's something that people, I think collectively we know, but we don't necessarily talk about. The fact that so many of us have felt underserved in the healthcare community, and as a physician, to be able to talk about it bravely is a huge thing. And so this conversation is important. It's how things change. It's how things get better. So thank you, Dr. Elizabeth Comen, for being here today. How many of us have been told we're ridiculous, we're hysterical? You're here, yes, all of us, right? We're over-emotional, we're not based in reality. You're here to tell us all we're not crazy.
Definitely not.
What do you want women to know? Why did you write this book?
Well, exactly that reason. We struggled, the editor, the publisher, to try to figure out what was the right title to kind of encompass what this book was about. And we had lots of different ideas. And at one point, we came up with this all in her head. All in her head. It's all in your fucking head, right? And the moment we kind of sat with it for just a second, realized this is what we've all heard. This is what I have heard. This is what I've heard my patients hear, some of whom are in the room today, that, they're too young to have breast cancer, or their pain is just because, they're a new mom and they're tired and whatever, not the autoimmune disease that they may have, or their stomach's bothering them because they're anxious. So I just felt so compelled to write this book after a long time of taking care of thousands of women and hearing these stories, not just in the cancer context, but my own experience as a patient, as a caregiver to women in my family, and really just motivated to change that narrative. And I just want to pause for a second because you mentioned Olivia, and I didn't know that you knew her till you posted about her. And just, since we've taken it emotional already, I met her. She was an extraordinary dancer and committed to really thriving in extraordinarily challenging circumstances. And so much of this book is about how we women should be honored and allowed to thrive. And she truly did. She did so with her dance and her rhythm and her love and soul connected to dance. And I shared in that with her, and I'm so grateful that she touched you too, and all of us. And she lives on in this book in that spirit.
Thank you for saying that. She was one of the most beautiful people I've ever met.
Yeah.
And thanks to Jen for me being able to know her. I wouldn't have known her otherwise.
Yeah.
But thank you for saying that. I know that obviously a lot of us here are joined by breast cancer, but breast cancer isn't the only thing that affects women. And you talked about in your book that a lot of times women are looked at in this lens of bikini medicine, right? It's all about OBGYN issues or breast cancer, but so many women are being misdiagnosed for a wealth of reasons.
Yeah.
Why is that still happening today?
So, I think it's multiple different levels. The medical education system, but our culture, all kind of intertwining to leave women out of the equation on so many different levels. When I was in medical school, I was like, I'm not going to be a women's health doctor. That's kind of gynecology. I'm interested in cancer and yes, breast cancer. But even then, I didn't consider that a women's health issue. And in writing this book, I take care of thousands of women. There is every page, there's something that I didn't know. despite my field as a doctor caring for women. I would interview doctors in different specialties. For example, with cardiology, I didn't know that the EKG can, which is a measure of the electrical conductivity of your heart, can change depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle. That arrhythmias can be different when women are postmenopausal. That it wasn't developed based on a woman, but on the 70 kilogram reference male. So every page of this book was something that I did not realize affected women's health. Even the field of urology. When you think of urology, I mean, you already said fuck, so I'm just going to go out there. Even so, the field of urology, when I think of it as really just like men's genitalia, right? But women have tons of urologic issues that are predominantly in them. It is not normal after you have children to not be able to run without peeing in your pants, or every time you jump rope or get on a trampoline that you're dribbling. You don't have to suffer with that. And so many women don't realize that for all of these urologic conditions, there's actually help for them and unique treatments for them. And the field of urology is predominantly male doctors with male patients. So there's so much that we're just forgotten along the way, where both doctors and women in society aren't aware that there's actually fields of medicine to help them.
Wow. And so much of where we are today is based on research that wasn't done for women. Where are we on the research part of this, which I would assume helps you catch up to figuring out what's going on right now?
So we're doing better, but things that I didn't know this. It wasn't until 1993 that the National Institute of Health required that any clinical trial that was being done include women. 1993.
Wow.
Okay? That doesn't even reflect all the studies that, in order to, before you introduce a drug or do anything to a human, you got to do it to an animal or a petri dish, right? And those were predominantly done on male mice or male-derived cells, right? So a lot of the drugs, a lot of the techniques, a lot of the imaging that we use were all developed either on males or on male mice or on male cells in a petri dish. And we're still playing catch up. So there's a lot going on now to kind of close these disparities, but it's going to take a long time. So for example, there's the Women's Research Initiative that came out of the White House, which is a great platform where Dr. Biden said, we have to start investing in women's health. But they had $0 to begin with. So now they have $100 million. They're trying to shuffle around different amounts, but $100 million is just a drop in the bucket. We have to be able to put our money where our mouth is and direct research that is exclusively towards women and diseases that are either female predominant or unique to women.
Wow. So obviously it's predominantly women here tonight.
Yes.
We've established that. What do you want every woman who came out here tonight to hear you to take away from what you're saying to their next doctor's visit? What can we do to empower ourselves?
I have some of my patients here, so I mean, what are we going to talk about? I think a lot of the motivation in writing this book, a lot of people said to me, well, is this, when I first sought out to write it, was it going to be prescriptive or descriptive? Prescriptive meaning here are the 10 things that you need to do when you show up to the doctor's office. And I really wanted to, before I wrote anything like that, think about what's the legacy that we inherit. So the first step is kind of, both as the doctor myself, but as the patient, what are the stories we've been told about our bodies by our family, by society, by our culture? How is that really interacting with what you talk to your doctor about, what you're afraid of, what you're ashamed of, what you feel blamed for, what you feel in pain for and think you're just meant to endure? So I want everyone to kind of, at the end of reading this book, think about when you've heard these stories of women from the 17th century, from the Egyptians, from the Greeks, you may recognize a piece of yourself in history and in these compelling stories and say, after reading this and seeing a different side of it, could I tell myself a different story about my body? So when you go to your doctor's office, what are the questions that you've just kind of been embarrassed to ask, afraid to ask, concerned to ask? Could you start doing that now? That's really, really what I hope that they can get from it. And also feel that you do not deserve to be in pain. You do not deserve to feel shame. You do not deserve to feel blamed for whatever it is that you're going through. And can we change that sense of advocacy for yourself? And if you don't like your doctor, find a new one.
I love that. At least get a second opinion.
Yeah.
And if someone is offended by that, there's your answer.
Definitely. I've had a lot of patients say, I don't want my doctor to know that I'm here. And that's a bad sign, right? You should feel comfortable that we all work together. Cancer is a complex, complicated problem. I'm happy to have anybody get second, third, fourth, fifth opinions. I love that because we need to have the confidence to work together.
You mentioned cancer. Obviously, a lot of women in this room are here because of that. This is 5 Under 40. And as I touched on briefly, most people, I would argue, believe breast cancer is a disease that happens to women post-menopause. But for many of us in this room, it happened pre-menopause. And I'm included in that number. And it's so alarming because even the American Cancer Society has had to acknowledge in their annual report that breast cancer, along with 5 other cancers, I believe, are rising.
Yes.
Rising at an alarming rate in people under the age of 50. Do we know why?
Yeah. So one of the things that's enraging to me, and I may digress, so you're going to do your fabulous journalist thing and rein me back in and whatever. So one of the things that I find enraging is, so over 14,000 women under the age of 40 are diagnosed with breast cancer every year. And as we know, I don't need to tell this room, these are women predominantly finding their cancers themselves because we have this narrative that there's nothing, that self-breast exams are not so helpful. How is that effing possible, right? So I advocate that your breasts are on your body, you should know what they feel like. You should go to your doctor if you're not certain about how to do a self-breast exam. It's not that we're expecting patients to, suddenly become oncologists, but we shouldn't deny women this path to understand themselves better and advocate for themselves when they go to their doctor's office. Because far too many women I see were told they were too young or it was just a blocked milk duct, and they're missed along the way. And we are catching cancers later than we want to. In terms of unmet needs and what's going on, this is a huge unmet need for our society because we know that mammograms are not ideal for dense breasts. When women are under the age of 40, you're more likely to have dense breasts. And yes, we can do MRIs and mammograms and ultrasounds, but we need more research to figure out how do we better find early stage breast cancers in young women. In terms of what's going on with respect to this rise of incidence of breast cancer and colon cancer and other types of cancers, we are still trying to figure that out. Clearly, there must be some environmental cause. There must be, I'm saying must, we don't know. But certainly with colon cancer, we worry about lots of processed meats and dietary contributions. But at the same time, we also know that there are women that are doing everything right and still getting breast cancer. So there's something that we're missing. And when we have in this narrative, if you don't eat red meat ever, if you never touch alcohol, if you exercise like a maniac every day, your life's going to be perfect. That is not a good narrative to be telling women because cancer is something that is in part out of our control. There are things that we can do for risk reduction, but we're not all going to be able to have this no risk of cancer. We all have it.
Can I ask you a question? This has been so frustrating to me I'll make it very brief, but for people
Why make it brief?
Well, for people who don't know my story, I would never have had a mammogram at 40 because at that point it was recommended that you had to be 50.
Yeah.
Or that was the recommendation to be 50 to have your first mammogram. And then after that, I believe it was every 2 years if you had no family history, which I did not. I would not have had a mammogram at 40 had I not had an assignment at work to do that for Breast Cancer Awareness Month. Why then would a U.S. organization recommend that women wait until they're 50 to have their first mammogram? Is this about money? Is this about saving money? Is this about the insurance companies? Because clearly we know that if you get cancer at an early age, premenopausal, it's more likely to be aggressive. Yeah. It's more likely that you need early intervention. So why is this happening? Why the mixed messaging?
I think it's so frustrating, right? And I think it's complicated on so many levels. And some part of it is money, right? Because we can't we're not doing PET scans on everybody 24/7, but also if we did that, it also wouldn't be helpful. Right? So when you balance out mammogram and screening, the problem is if we just started screening everybody at 21, we would be doing a lot of false positives, a lot of anxiety, a lot of biopsies because it's not the right test. But I agree with you that the standard guidelines when they were 50, when they were 45, and now they're 40, thank God they're 40 now, thank God. But
that's fairly recent.
It's only recent, only within the last year or so. And women might not always have it covered by insurance, which is a huge problem. But I think The biggest issue is we have to do better than the standard mammogram for younger women, right? And whether that's pairing it with a blood test or doing some other things to help pick up tiny cancer cells that could be circulating before, they ever form any real palpable mass in the breast.
Because the earlier you detect cancer, the better chance you have at surviving it.
Right.
End of story. Another misconception about women's health is that if you're thin, you're healthy.
Yeah.
Where's the misconception? It's not true.
It's not true, but I think there's this long history that I go over in the gut chapter and also the muscular chapter about the history of fitness for women. So much of what women have been taught about our bodies is that smaller is better, daintier is better. There's no point to us lifting weights, right? But you should be lithe and have these long, slender muscles. Think about the advertisements for some of these like Pilates classes that are like, don't worry, you're not going to get bulky muscles, right? Because there's this fear that you're going to look like too manly, too bulky, not dainty, not frail, not coughing up blood as a tuberculosis patient in the 19th century, not the heroin chic, right? Not the Victorian woman who's eschewing the red meat because that will signal just some sort of all types of appetites that she's not allowed to have, right? So I think throughout history, at various points, and that's what I try to show through storytelling, is this idea of the frail, breathless, dainty woman who needs a man to control her and be stronger than her plays out in history, in literature, in art, and in medicine. And we miss a lot about how to actually promote women's health in those stories. So I see a lot of women, particularly on the Upper East Side, where it's all about fitting into a size 2 jean and they can't lift their groceries, right? And they've got high risk for, if they don't already have it, osteoporosis. They're running like maniacs. They're not eating enough. And they have poor bone density, even despite the running. So there's a lot that needs to change, and particularly with this Ozempic craze in this zip code, all these women are wanting to be on Ozempic to lose 3 or 4 pounds, again, to fit into some size 2 jean, but they're also losing muscle mass. They're not having enough protein, and that's really going to affect their longevity over time.
Yeah, I mean, I have 2 daughters. I know you have a daughter as well, but my 17-year-old, I was trying to get her to lift with me, and she was like, "Oh, I don't want muscles." And that really bothered me. I was like, this isn't about bulking up. It's about being strong. It's about being fit. It's about being able to do exactly what you just said. What do you think some of the common misconceptions are for women about sports and exercise and diet and muscle mass? Like, why aren't we getting this right?
It's interesting. There was I think that this is, again, a story of what we've been told, that we think we've come so far, but have we really? There was a famous Harvard Medical School trained physician, Tenley Albright, who became a surgeon, operated extensively through Harvard Teaching Hospital. She was also an Olympic figure skater in the 1970s, came from a famous family in Boston. And I went back in time to read, well, what did she say? This Olympic athlete and this empowered surgeon. She had this whole narrative about, well, figure skating is elegant and feminine, but you really shouldn't be rowing, you shouldn't be lifting weights, you shouldn't do anything that makes you look too manly. Too masculine. And I think there is this fear that somehow a strong woman is not a feminine woman. And that plays out in how we coach about exercise, how we teach women how to eat, whether you can actually look hungry and eat what's in front of you. And I think myself included have been subject to that. I mean, I for years did tons and tons of cardio, didn't even know how to strength train.
And it's something that we need to continually remind ourselves and our daughters and those around us.
And there's also, when we think about diet, right, there is a lot to be said about a plant-forward diet, less processed meats, less artificial foods. We also don't want women just like eating like rabbits in grass all day long and not have any calories and not have any protein. So a lot of these narratives have left women hungry, starving, eating leaves,
angry,
moody, right? and then losing muscle mass because they're not ingesting anything to build that.
Yeah. No, it totally makes sense. Something else and I think this will resonate with a lot of women in the room. I was on a drug, as many of you might have been or are on currently, that takes away your estrogen.
Yeah.
But then there's this whole other hormone replacement therapy. My mom was on it, and she didn't want to admit it to me because she thought that I'd somehow be upset about it because of its connection or alleged connection to breast cancer. There's so much controversy around hormone replacement therapy once you're postmenopausal. I wouldn't dare even consider it, obviously, having been on tamoxifen for the last 8 years. But what is where do you stand on hormone replacement therapy? Has it gotten a bad rap? Like, what are the misconceptions?
We're going to, again, you rein me in, but we're going to go back in time for a little bit. This guy, Dr. Brown-Séquard. Dr. Brown-Séquard at the turn of the century was feeling a little less masculine and virile in his 70s and wanted to know what he could do to revive himself. So he became obsessed with crushing guinea pig testicles and injecting them into himself as this early form of hormone replacement therapy for himself. For men, interestingly enough. He was proven to be a scam and a sham and all these things. He got pushed out of different medical societies. But he was part of an early movement to figure out what made men amazing and strong and virile. But on the other side, there must be something that makes women just so freaking crazy. And when you look at the history of the discovery of hormones and how understanding the mindset that history and medicine don't exist in a vacuum but are inextricably connected by who is conducting the science, with the discovery of estrogen, it was assumed that there was going to be one thing that made women insane and one thing that made men amazing. And that is this binary approach to the discovery of hormones. Now, when they started to figure out, okay, well, because they were studying it in horses, that, oh my God, some of the male horses were making estrogen. They couldn't understand like how this could possibly be because, of course, men can have estrogen and women can have testosterone. But this early binary black and white approach to the discovery of hormones really limited, even to today, our understanding of how to use hormones. Now, the history of hormone replacement therapy is equally bonkers. So the real champion of it was this guy. He wrote this book, Feminine Forever, early on. His last name was Wilson. One of the stories in his book where he's really talking about how much of a champion he was about giving this to everybody was a guy from the mafia came, he didn't know he was in the mafia, but he comes in and he says, you got to fix my wife because I'm dying of lung cancer and I need her to take care of me and she's freaking crazy. So I hear you can make her better by giving her some hormones. He pulls out a gun and basically says he's going to kill her unless this doctor fixes his crazy wife who needs to take care of him before he dies, right? So this is his championing women's health, is he's going to fix this woman who can then take care of her husband in the mafia. So this guy who wrote Feminine Forever launched this whole pharmaceutical push to give tons and tons of women hormone replacement therapy. And then, of course, we know that there was a study that came out decades later that was misread and to this day needs to be debunked, that said, well, everybody that takes hormone replacement therapy is at risk for breast cancer. You can't ever do it. And during medical school, in my training, the idea of any woman taking hormone replacement therapy was just like blasphemous. How could you possibly consider it?
Vain, right?
Vain. And we know today that there are some women that can dramatically benefit from it. But here's what becomes really interesting in this group here and why I'm so frustrated by the narrative. So there are many women who have triple negative breast cancer, right? Why can't we give some of those women hormone replacement therapy back? Show me a study that's ever really been done to prove that we can. There was a recent journal article that basically showed that there may be a role for triple negative breast cancer patients in giving them hormone replacement therapy. There's also only been the studies to show that even for women who have estrogen receptor positive breast cancer, who may be having painful intercourse and tissue changes that could really benefit from estrogen, that it is safe to give intravaginal estrogen. Why did it take so damn long for us to figure this out? And I think it's because we've dismissed women's sexual health. We've dismissed their symptoms of menopause, and that affects including the breast cancer population.
That's shocking to hear.
Yeah, but there's a whole movement of women physicians, especially gynecologists, urogynecologists, to say, we need to study this better. We need to figure out, is there ever going to be a role for giving hormone replacement therapy to breast cancer patients? We don't fully know the answer to that.
All right. That's really interesting. Something that we talked about, and by the way, shameless plug here, you can listen to Dr. Comen on our podcast. It drops tonight at midnight. But TJ and I talked to you about this, and this really stood out to us. You made a very clear point to say that this was data-driven. But if you look at the data, if you are a woman, are you better served
with a female doctor versus a male doctor?
Yeah. So, I mean, Journal of American Medical Association, again, there have been multiple studies that show that women listen better, spend longer with their patients, are perceived as being more empathic, and have better outcomes for their patients. That is not to say that there aren't amazing male physicians across the board. But I think what it speaks to is the expectation that we all as women have in our other professions as well, is that we're expected to be more nurturing. We're expected to be more empathic. We don't expect that from male physicians in the same way. Oh, he's really smart, the nurse is there to care for me, right? But the female physician is expected to do all of the above. And honestly, it leads to different levels of burnout at every specialty I talk to, including intensive care unit doctors, ICU doctors, who said, I'm like a trauma surgeon. I'm not like some touchy-feely person, but I'm expected as a woman to be that mom consult. And we have a real problem in terms of the gender divide, the sex divide of what we expect from our physicians based on who's in front of us. If you are a female and you are operated on by a female physician, you are a female surgeon, you are more likely to have a better outcome than if you are operated on by a male physician. This is a well-known study that came out this year. If you're a male, it doesn't matter who you're operated on. That's just simply ridiculous, right? We have to change that. And I don't think it's because men or women are inherently better. I think it's that we've demanded better. We've assumed and expected expectations about women physicians that I think we should expect of everybody who's in front of us.
Do you think, though, that there are still male physicians, based on history, based on bias, based on whatever, who do look at women in moments? We talked about this diagnosis of hysteria that was on the books till 1980.
Yeah.
Do you think that's still in a lot of people's heads?
I
Males,
do think,
perhaps more than women's.
I think I absolutely do. I've seen it. I've experienced myself as a patient. I also think that women can be subject to that as well.
Yeah.
Right? When we look at if someone has, and I'm being very careful here because I know patients and their diagnoses here, but historically, if someone had IBS in their irritable bowel syndrome in their past medical history, oh, she's going to be a difficult patient. Chronic fatigue syndrome, which we know nothing about, or fibromyalgia, she's going to be a difficult patient. I think men and women physicians have been biased because when we don't know what we're talking about, when we don't know what a disease is, and these are things that we don't know a lot about, we make assumptions about the patient in front of us. I've done that historically, and part of writing this book was rewriting my own understanding of the patient in front of me and my own bias and confronting that.
It's all in her head.
All in her head.
That's a very apropos title, given all that we know and all that you've researched. Something else that was really fascinating that you talk about in this book, that you write about, is the history of plastic surgery. It's not what you think it is.
Yeah.
Where did it begin? How did it evolve?
Yeah. So I didn't really know this either, but the history of plastic surgery goes and what we were able to do today, because it's only in recent, over the last century that we had anesthesia, that you could operate on somebody just asleep, right? Most people were getting amputations. That was the kind of surgery they were having. We didn't have the same skill set now. We didn't have anesthesia. They would strap people down and just cut off some organ because, they were going to die of gangrene. With the rise of anesthesia and also the rise of new weaponry from different wars, people had gruesome injuries. So a lot of plastic surgery arose initially from the reconstruction that was required on the battlefield. But then, because of that understanding and these new techniques about how to build men back from the war, we also learned how to fix that ugly woman and make her more beautiful so she could find a man. And now the patient presenting to the plastic surgeon and the rise of that whole field was healthy women who could be operated on with no pain and change their face and change their body. One of the stories that I talk about in the book is of a physician who operated on in a huge ballroom in New York City of a woman who was a criminal. And he basically was saying that, well, if we fix her face, she was a murderer. She had murdered, I think it was her husband, I can't recall. And if you fix her face, well, she'll become less of a criminal. Because
she won't be so angry.
She won't be so angry and she won't be so ugly. and she'll have a chance at a new life. And so part of the reason why I wanted to really trace the field of plastic surgery and dermatology is because obviously, like, I care about the way that I look. I'm thrilled with Botox, but I want women to think about, thank God, I want women to think about what are the things that they're coming to their doctor about and why. Is it for yourself because you really, this is going to make you feel better and stronger and more powerful in your own body? Or are we subjecting ourselves to a punishing beauty standard that we can never catch up with? I don't think that there's a perfect answer there. I think this is a nuanced conversation that will continue over time, but one that is deeply steeped in culture as well. Like things like the labiaplasty, which I talk about, that is not a surgery that we were doing up until very recently. This whole idea of a Barbie vagina and how they're supposed to look and what's normal and what's not.
How do you know? Like,
exactly.
Do you look at other people's vaginas?
Exactly.
I don't even know what does a Barbie vagina look like?
Yeah, well, you can Google it, but they're hawking it all. They're hawking it all over. They're hawking it all over the internet, and there are a lot of surgeons talking about it. Now, there are some instances where this could bring comfort to a woman, a cyclist, whatever it may be, right? Or they want to change the way they look for aesthetic reasons. But this is one of the fastest rising surgeries. Wow. And the question is why? And I really go through what is a racist and very complicated history of how we've looked at women's genitalia throughout time, how little we are taught in medical school. And
2005?
Yeah.
2005?
Oh, 2005 was when we first mapped the clitoris. Yeah. You remember that date? I got you with that one.
But I was just like, my mind was blown. Wait, that's the first time someone, a female.
Yes, urologist.
A female urologist mapped a woman's clitoris was 2005?
2005. And I had already graduated med school. So, you know.
I mean, I was 10
had
years
to do
outside
some
of
experimenting
college.
myself.
Wow, that's hard to get your head around.
Yeah.
And when you talk about heart disease, the leading killer of women, and then you talked about some autoimmune disorders, MS, et cetera.
Yeah.
These are diseases you've written about that we're not little men. We're not mini men.
Yeah.
We are completely different and separate from men, and yet we're not studied distinctively, or we haven't been historically, to try and deal with these types of diseases. Because, for instance, even the symptoms that women have, that they present when they have heart disease are completely different from men, and oftentimes are just regarded as anxiety.
Exactly. Two examples that you're bringing up that I want to talk about. So, heart disease, #1 killer of women. Okay, in medical school and to this day, the way that we perceive women's symptoms of a heart attack are repeatedly referred to in the lay public and also in the way we teach medical students as atypical, because it's not always that crushing chest pain that you imagine men having, which they can have and which you see in the movies. That is a huge problem. Women are more likely to call an ambulance on their husband than call their doctor for their own symptoms for a heart attack, because they may not recognize what they are. Autoimmune diseases, 80% more likely in women than men. And so many of these we don't even have the names for. There's a condition called POTS, which relates to your heart rate, and when you get up and stand up, you can be very dizzy, and it's a complicated diagnosis. But there are many women that may have developed this as a result of being exposed to COVID, and it is more predominant in women. I recently had a patient who went to so many different cardiologists, young woman with these symptoms of POTS syndrome, also known as Grinch syndrome, which is so fascinating. Think of the language, because women have smaller hearts. Grinch syndrome. Wow. Language is so important, right? So it can be all sorts of different things, but dizziness when you get up, heart racing, fatigue. And it took her seeing 4 different cardiologists for her to even be diagnosed with it.
You know, it's so crazy. I had the honor of interviewing one of my favorite actresses of all time, Susan Lucci, aka Erica Kane. But what's crazy is, so she presented with heart disease symptoms, with the jaw pain, like the atypical. Her husband actually convinced her at the time, to call the doctor. She goes in, she gets treated. She sits down and talks with me. It happens again, and she still doesn't recognize it. I mean, it's so crazy how we're conditioned to not believe that we're experiencing something acute or something serious and pass it off as something else. Even when you've gone through it, spoken about it publicly, it happens again, and still there's self-doubt.
Of course.
To what do you attribute that?
I think that these legacies are hard and to break free from. I think these stories, these narratives are so hard. And in the conclusion of the book, I share a story about myself where here I am, I've written 11 chapters at this point about how to be this empowered woman, how much we're missing. And when you go to the doctor, like stand up for yourself and you go girl and like the whole thing. And that when I was in pain, I doubted myself. I apologized. I, at one point, was in the emergency room and I hadn't showered for 4 days because I couldn't pick my head up. I was in so much pain. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I probably smell. I'm so sorry. But in that much pain, like 100 out of 10 pain.
That's what you're worried about.
That's what I was worried about, is what was this nurse going to think of me? And I'm so embarrassed for myself, right? And I don't know what the answers are, but I think the more that we can talk about it, the more that we can share our stories, the more that we are vulnerable to the extent that we feel safe doing so, I think we create a movement and an environment where we make pacts with each other. I'm not going to feel shame. I'm not going to apologize. I am going to say when I'm struggling, and I'm not going to say to myself, I just need to endure it.
I know. I'm hopeful that by you writing this book and us talking about this and everyone sharing their stories, those vulnerable moments. I mean, this may sound silly, but my 20-year-old daughter thought it was so funny. And TJ and I talked about this. We weren't allowed to say the word vagina on ABC for whatever reason. I don't know why, but that just wasn't allowed. But I remember she would laugh at me because I would also like, shh. And I remember on the subway her saying, Mom, I came out of your vagina. It's not a bad word. So I'm hopeful. I see the younger generations going, snap out of it. This is biology. This is who we are. These are our bodies. Don't apologize for them. So I am hopeful that maybe our children will break the cycle. But in the meantime, it's on us to do that for ourselves, for each other, by sharing our stories. Something that really touched me, and I know touched TJ, to hear that you've had this experience of women on their deathbeds, worried about sweating, worried about having something that their body is naturally doing being embarrassing when they're literally fighting for their lives. You've witnessed that firsthand. It's powerful to hear. It's incredibly sad, but important to listen to.
Yeah. So when I first started writing this book and the intro, my editor was a little concerned that the opening, and for patients here, it does open with a woman on her deathbed, and said, this is just so depressing and so sad. I don't know that anyone's going to read this book after reading the first paragraph. And I just felt, but this is what I see, this is what I know, and this is what struck me. And so it does open with a woman who lived a beautiful life, and hours before her death I went to go see her and her family in the hospital, and all sorts of tubes and things, and sweating profusely from her struggle to live and in the dying process. And I hugged her goodbye, and she was so tender and so sweet and barely could breathe, and was just whispered to me through breaths, I'm so sorry I'm sweating on you. I just sweat on your cheek. And, she wouldn't be the first woman, nor the last, in these deeply sacred, privileged, heartbreaking moments to apologize in that way. And it just really struck me that even in these moments, this is what we're thinking about. And I thought that it was important to share.
It's incredible to talk about it, because that's how we realize what's important and what's not.
Yeah.
And what we don't need to be apologizing for. And so thank you for sharing those hard stories. Yeah. I know we got that in television news all the time. It's too sad to talk about. We don't want to talk about stage 4 metastatic breast cancer because it's sad. We have to talk about these things. We have to raise awareness. That's the only way change happens. I thank you all so much, and we really appreciate it. This is a big night, and it's an important message, and one I hope you'll share with everyone, and just know how much it means to me, to Dr. Comen here, that you all came out on a night like this, and we hope you enjoyed the evening.
Wait, I want to say one quick thing about you. I want to just say one thing about Amy, which is that, like Dr. Schmachters, like we don't really have that much of a platform. The reality is we need public faces to take on and tackle these issues. And it's not so easy to be so vulnerable and open and direct and advocate for women, not just yourself, but you have used this platform for tremendous good, shared of yourself in extraordinary ways. And I know there's so many unwanted, lonely stories of women who have felt that they were not alone because of what you shared and what you continue to share. So none of this would happen without your voice, and I'm really grateful.
Thank you. Thank you.